June 6, 1944, 5 a.m., Crisp Battery, Normandy coast. The binoculars shook minutely in the hands of Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen as he scanned the horizon, imprinting an image in his mind that would haunt him forever. In the dim light before sunrise, he saw a sight that went against every assurance given by the High Command. The English Channel, once regarded as a natural barrier defending the Third Reich's western edge, had become a metallic thoroughfare, a never-ending procession of ships from one end of the horizon to the other, their shapes blending into a continuous wave of looming catastrophe. The invading force included 6,939 ships, consisting of 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary craft, and 864 merchant ships crewed by more than 195,000 sailors from 8 Allied nations. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery was commanded to commence firing. 3 minutes after that, at 5:55 a.m., the initial projectiles from his 210 mm Czech-manufactured Skoda artillery pieces arced toward the oncoming armada. It was as if water drops were being thrown at a tidal wave. His battery engaged the American cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy along with the battleship USS Nevada. By 6:30 a.m., his gunners would claim the USS Corey, which was the only American destroyer destroyed on D-Day. From his reinforced concrete observation station atop the Crisbecq battery, the 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German combatant to spot and fire upon the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. What Ohm observed on his Zeiss rangefinder that daybreak was not merely an invasion navy. It embodied an industrial power the Nazi propaganda machine had told him would be impossible. The arithmetic of collapse was advancing on him at 8 knots. The change had set in motion. Within a few hours, German officers all over Normandy would witness Allied industrial strength as never before, destroying every belief about their adversaries' abilities and signaling the origin of the downfall for Hitler's proposed thousand-year empire. The gloom of June 5 had already delivered warnings of trouble. At Army Group B's headquarters in Laros-Guyong, which was 50 miles from the shoreline, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, who had been the Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April 15, 1944, kept an eye on a steady stream of alarming updates. Rommel himself was away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, thinking the weather ruled out any invasion. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army was informed about massive parachute landings throughout Normandy. Over 13,000 soldiers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were being dropped by Douglas C-47 Skytrains. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, overseeing the 84th Corps from his command post in St. Lau, understood at once. Having served on the Eastern Front and losing a leg at Stalingrad, Marx had developed a soldier's intuition finely tuned by years of warfare. But even Marx, among the Wehrmacht's most seasoned leaders, could not grasp the full magnitude of what was about to unfold. The German soldiers had anticipated an invasion, but they had not braced themselves for the overwhelming material superiority that would crush them. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, assigned as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, dedicated months to reviewing the shore defenses. Born into a family of naval tradition in 1894, Ruge possessed a grasp of sea operations unmatched by any other German officer stationed in France. He had advocated for increasing the number of sea mines, barriers, and artillery. Nonetheless, as he would recount in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, we were bracing for the previous war. They were arriving with the future one. The German command structure believed the Allies could only attempt an invasion with possibly 20 divisions and no more than 3,000 ships. Their predictions came from their own level of capability, their restrictions, and the war-induced weariness of their industry. Following 5 years of conflict, as dawn began to break over the Normandy shoreline on June 6, German lookouts in fortified posts and bunkers from Cherbourg to Le Havre started sending back reports of an unthinkable development. They saw not mere hundreds, but thousands of vessels. This was not a diversion or minor raid. but rather the biggest seaborne assault in recorded history. At the heavily fortified position designated WN-62, which overlooked the area later called Omaha Beach, Gerrit Heinrich Severloh gazed out through the firing slit of his machine gun at 5:45 a.m. The young man, only 20 years old and hailing from Metzing where he worked on a farm, had never previously set eyes on the sea before his posting to Normandy. But now, the sea itself was hidden from view, replaced entirely by metal. Boats everywhere, Severloh would recount in his memoirs, large vessels, small ones, barges with broad bottoms, destroyers weaving about like sheepdogs. The horizon had disappeared. I attempted to tally their number but halted once I reached 100. The count was in the thousands. All along the 50-mile stretch of the invasion front, both German officers and enlisted men came to the same stunning conclusion. What faced them was not only a superior force, but an altogether greater magnitude. At 5:30 a.m., naval shelling began in earnest. The fleet had at its disposal 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. This moment would be the defenders' first brutal education in the realities of American industrial output. The battleship USS Texas, by itself, unleashed 255 shells from its 14-inch guns within the first 60 minutes. Each projectile tipped the scales at 1,400 pounds. Within an hour, just one vessel had delivered 178 tons of powerful explosives, an amount surpassing the total ammunition reserves held by numerous German artillery units. Even prior to a single Allied soldier stepping onto those beaches, naval forces had already discharged close to 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships, a combined total of about 130,000 tons of explosives. General der Infanterie Gab Blumenrath, serving as Chief of Staff for the Commander-in-Chief West, later stated, "We had armed ourselves to do battle against soldiers. Instead, we found our adversaries were factories." At 6 a.m., as naval shells continued to devastate the Atlantic Wall, German defenders witnessed a second exhibition of Allied industrial supremacy. The sky became crowded with airplanes, not just dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Allied air units completed over 14,000 sorties to support the landings, having already won full control of the skies. The Luftwaffe, for its part, could muster approximately 300 serviceable aircraft throughout France. On D-Day itself, they managed 319 sorties. Allied squadrons flew 14,674 sorties. There were 46 Allied planes in the sky for each German one. These numbers were not only unfavorable but downright preposterous. Major Esepp Prill, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 26, led the only Luftwaffe assault on the invasion beaches that morning. Accompanied only by his wingman, Hans Bodaschik, he strafed Sword Beach one time before being chased off by swarms of Allied fighters. This well-known event, cited in multiple historical records, provided clear evidence of the utter helplessness of German air power. In spite of the overwhelming firepower that confronted them, some German defenders at specific locations initially thought they could withstand the attack. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied prime defensive terrain on the heights above the sand. Bunkers constructed of concrete guarded with machine guns produced overlapping fields of fire. The earliest waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions charged headlong into deadly resistance. As soon as the Americans landed at 6:30 a.m., machine guns in the resistance strongholds opened up. Heinrich Severloh, who was at his MG-42 in Widerstandsnest 62, expended more than 12,000 rounds that day, as proved by his personal account. He watched dozens, even hundreds, of Americans fall. The surf filled with bodies. The sands grew crimson with blood. There was a momentary sense that perhaps the Atlantic Wall would not be breached. That changed when the destroyers entered the action. At around 8 a.m., with conditions on Omaha Beach desperate and General Omar Bradley contemplating withdrawal, something extraordinary unfolded. American destroyers, ignoring both the risk of running ashore and the presence of mines, advanced to a distance as close as 1,000 yards from the shoreline, a range considered point-blank for naval artillery. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt trained their 5-inch guns on individual German fortifications. At such close quarters, it was impossible to miss. This maneuver, extensively recorded in naval documentation, played a pivotal role in shattering the German line at Omaha. For German officers, this was the moment when the true force of American industrial capacity became evident. It was not simply the immense quantity of ships involved, it was also the readiness to hazard those vessels, treating them as expendable. When the destroyer USS Corrie was sunk, others took her place at once. The ships were not unique, priceless assets as they were for the Kriegsmarine. To the Americans, they were instruments, and in abundance more stood ready. As the day advanced, German spotters observed something that contradicted their knowledge of seaborne assaults. The landing craft continued to arrive, one wave following another, for hours on end. An unceasing stream of troops and equipment moved steadily from the water onto land. The assortment of tailored vessels left the German observers astonished. Landing craft tanks, known as LCTs, unloaded 30-ton Sherman tanks right onto the sands. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, huge ships measuring 328 feet in length, ran aground and swung open their bow doors to allow full tank companies to roll out. DUKW trucks, designed for amphibious use, paddled onto land, rolled over the beaches, and supplied combat formations with materiel on the spot. By the end of that day, the Allies had put ashore roughly 156,000 soldiers, comprising 132,715 by water and 23,400 from the air. This Allied presence was larger than the complete German 7th Army charged with Normandy's defense. Within the inauguration's first day, the officially noted feat by the Allies included 156,000 troops, 20,000 motor vehicles, 1,700 armored tanks, and 15,000 tons in supplies. The 7th Army, guarding the whole Normandy zone, had under 500 usable tanks. On the opening day, Allied troops landed a total triple that number. The German military's response to the incursion demonstrated not only material inadequacy, but also a broader collapse amid an overpowering adversary's strength. The famed Panzer divisions, which had overtaken France within 6 weeks in 1940, found themselves immobilized by the Allied dominance of the skies and continued bombardment from naval guns. The 21st Panzer Division, which was the only armor formation near enough to respond during D-Day, initiated their counterassault at 4 p.m. That division required a full 3 hours to make the 10-mile journey from Ranville to and across Caen. What might have been a fierce armored assault became instead a sorrowful line of destroyed vehicles. When the remaining panzers finally encountered British positions in the vicinity of Sword Beach, they were met by naval artillery fire, which was coordinated by Allied spotters on the ground. HMS Warspite, situated 15 miles off the coast, launched 15-inch shells that could pierce any tank then constructed. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, leading the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, later wrote in his memoirs, "The enemy's material advantage was so tremendous that our own forces were shattered like a wave breaking against the rocks." On June 7, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance planes returned aerial images that higher German command at first doubted. The Allies were assembling harbors, not taking over existing ports but actually creating them from scratch on open water. The Mulberry harbors demonstrated an industrial output on a scale that almost defied reasoning. Made in Britain, these makeshift ports used 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 piers, 10 miles of floating roads, and 93 ships deliberately sunken to serve as barriers. By the end of 2 weeks, the Mulberry installations were unloading 9,000 tons of materials each day, outdoing several French harbors. The Germans had labored for 4 years constructing the Atlantic Wall to safeguard the harbors. The Allies had simply rendered ports unnecessary. During the month of June 1944, German leadership slowly grasped the full extent of their intelligence breakdown. The complex ruse known as Operation Fortitude had persuaded German intelligence authorities that the Normandy invasion was merely a diversion. They believed the true offensive would strike at Paradakal, supposedly under the direction of Patton's imaginary 1st United States Army Group. For several crucial weeks, German reserve troops were held in place, anticipating an assault that never materialized. Generaloberst Panzertrooper Leo von Schweppenberg, who led Panzer Group West, learned of the deception after seized documents exposed Patton's real presence in Normandy, where he actually led the authentic Third Army. As the days of June turned into July, German officers' submissions to superior command reflected rising desperation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a phone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at the OKW, pressing him for reasons why the invasion forces had not been hurled back into the ocean. When Keitel inquired about recommended actions, Rundstedt famously responded, "Negotiate peace, you idiots. What other option remains?" This act of candor led to Rundstedt's swift removal from his post. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had an audience with Hitler on June 17 at Margeville in France. In well-documented accounts, Rommel provided data outlining the futility of Germany's situation. Absolute Allied aerial dominance, German units operating at 30% of their effective strength, and the inability to maneuver by day because of overwhelming naval artillery fire. Hitler's reply was to prohibit any withdrawal, demanding unwavering resistance instead. Rommel departed the conference convinced of Germany's inevitable fall. Within weeks, he would become implicated in the July 20 plot to kill Hitler and would be compelled to take his own life. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff who survived the conflict, would later write in Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy campaign, stating, "Our defeat was not due to superior soldiers or tactics. We were overwhelmed by sheer material resources." The battle for Kursk proved how pointless German resistance was in the face of Allied superiority in materiel. On July 7, 467 heavy RAF bombers unleashed 2,500 tons of ordnance onto Caen in just 40 minutes, which was more destructive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend among Germany's most elite formations, entered the Normandy campaign with 20,540 troops and 150 tanks. 6 weeks later, only 300 remained, with 0 tanks, suffering a loss of 8,000 men in the Falaise Gap alone. The American breakout, Operation Cobra, began on July 25 and showcased the undeniable dominance of the Allies. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers released 3,300 tons of bombs in a mass bombing, covering a zone of merely 6,000 by 2,200 yards. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of a panzer division posted directly under the attack, reported, "My entire division has been wiped out. We do not face merely an army, but the entire industrial machine." The Panzer-Lehr Division, which had moved into Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 troops, disappeared as a fighting unit. Out of 3,000 soldiers within the bombarded area, 1,000 were killed instantly, 1,000 wounded, and 1,000 more too traumatized to continue fighting. The tragedy of friendly fire claimed 111 American lives and left 490 wounded, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the most senior U.S. officer killed in the European theater. Still, these losses failed to alter the outcome of the operation. The Falaise Pocket, between August 12 and 21 Stone, 1944, became the burial site of German forces in Normandy. Official figures were catastrophic. Between 10,000 and 15,000 Germans killed, from 40,000 to 50,000 captured, 344 tanks and self-propelled artillery destroyed in the northern area alone, and 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles left behind. Additionally, 252 guns were lost. An estimated 20,000 to 50,000 Germans broke out, yet only as fragmented survivors rather than viable units. The German General Staff struggled to come to terms with the fact that this was not a conventional military battle, but a mathematical contest of production. Industrial data from 1944 demonstrated the overwhelming Allied production edge. In 1944, Germany manufactured 39,897 aircraft, reached a peak tank output of 1,854 in December, and turned out 68,000 military trucks. In comparison, U.S. production in 1944 amounted to 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 military trucks. These figures did not take British, Canadian, or Soviet output into account. Germany was contending with industrial capacity from the entire global community, armed only with the output of a medium-sized nation whose resources were being continually diminished by bombing raids. All told, American war production reached 297,000 planes, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. After the conflict, General Franz Halder, former head of the General Staff, calculated that by 1944 the Allies possessed around a 5-to-1 advantage in war production, with certain equipment, such as trucks, presenting a 10-to-1 disparity. "We were not defeated," he concluded. "We were erased by calculation." German commanders who survived the Normandy campaign experienced a profound psychological shift. They witnessed not mere defeat, but the total collapse of Nazi doctrines preaching German superiority and American fragility. Officers raised under Nazi ideals were particularly rattled. They had believed Americans to be weak, spoiled by comfort, and incapable of combat. Instead, they found that Americans deployed machines for hard labor, communications equipment for coordination, limitless munitions for training, and unwavering morale from boundless resources. The rate of suicide among German officers surged. Losing a war was one matter, the total shattering of one's beliefs was another. Aside from sheer numbers, German leaders now recognized a staggering technological divide that revealed how far Germany had fallen behind. The introduction of proximity fuses transformed anti-aircraft barrages into lethal force. Radar-enabled naval guns could deliver accurate fire onto inland targets from miles away with the first shell. DUKW amphibious trucks addressed logistical questions that Germany could neither conceive nor answer. The Allies' application of highly specialized vehicles especially astounded German observers. Hobart's Funny's custom tanks equipped to clear mines, span obstacles, or smash bunkers showed that technology and innovation, not just manpower, now resolved battlefield challenges. Through the entire Normandy campaign, German commanders developed a singular dread for naval gunfire. The Royal Navy battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch cannons could dispatch 2,448-pound shells more than 23 miles inland. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite turned their main weapons into tremendous artillery, annihilating anything in their sights. German gunners quickly learned that shelling enemy ships was pointless. Ships kept moving, and they returned fire with deadly intent. By the later part of July 1944, German mobility under daylight had ceased to be practical. Allied fighter-bombers, arranged in cab ranks and guided by forward air controllers, could strike at almost any target within minutes. The numbers were daunting. Allied aircraft in the theater surpassed 12,000, while German planes numbered between 300 and 500. The Allies could fly 5,000 to 8,000 missions each day. Germany managed only 50 to 100 sorties when possible. The conclusive data from the Normandy operations bear out the narrative of industrialized warfare and Allied accomplishment. Between June 6 and August 30, 1944, the Allies landed 2,552,299 personnel, 438,471 vehicles, and 398,259 tons of material, flying more than 480,000 sorties. German casualties in Normandy included 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, the loss of 2,200 tanks and assault guns, and the destruction of over 40 divisions. In 1954, a decade after D-Day, surviving German staff officers assembled in Bonn for a confidential symposium on Normandy. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, former chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, gave the opening speech. He declared, "In Normandy, we learned that the nature of warfare had fundamentally altered. No longer did armies face armies, it was now a confrontation of economies. While we tallied divisions, the enemy measured their factories. We assessed valor, they calculated throughput. The most vivid memory I have left is seeing American bulldozers shoving our wrecked tanks aside to make way for their supply lorries." The German commanders who witnessed D-Day underwent a lasting transformation. Hans Speidel later became a general in NATO, helping merge West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many of those who had fought in Normandy emerged as champions for European economic unity, convinced that only combined resources would allow Europeans to match American industries. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who led German forces in Italy, compared his front with Normandy's. "In Italy, we could battle the Allies on more equal terms. In Normandy, however, on open terrain that allowed the Allies to employ their entire industrial arsenal, our formations were simply wiped out." On June 6, 1984, the 40th commemoration of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen made a return to the Crisbecq battery as an honored guest. Once an Oberleutnant zur See, now aged 73, he stood on the same observation platform from which he had first spotted the invasion fleet. Addressing groups of veterans from both sides, he reflected, 40 years ago, I stood here and witnessed the unbelievable. A sea full of ships extending to the horizon. I realized in that moment that everything I'd been taught was false. Weak nations don't put together 7,000 ships. Divided countries can't plan such an assault. I fired my weapons at that armada, but it was like hurling rocks at the tide. We managed to sink a single destroyer and damage a handful more. For each ship we struck, 100 got by unscathed. Today's junior officers study Normandy's tactics, but the essential lesson is far simpler. In modern warfare, victory goes to the side that manufactures the most. We discovered that industrial capability equates to military strength. The fleet I saw that morning was not just an invasion force. It was the visible embodiment of American industry. The German officers who saw almost 7,000 Allied ships arrive on D-Day witnessed not just an amphibious assault, but a preview of how warfare would be shaped by industry moving forward. That unforgettable armada, impossibly vast and stretching across the sea, embodied the sheer might of democratic production put to military purpose, transcending traditional concepts of heroism or tactical skill. The Germans had readied themselves for battle, but what they faced was the unrestrained industrial force of the United States. In that instant of searing clarity, they knew they were witnessing not only the end of warfare as they had known it, but the onset of something unprecedented, industrial-scale war that rendered their skills obsolete. Their defeat was determined not by valor or error in tactics, but by arithmetic and sheer productive power. Failures in bravery never doomed them. Rather, it was a shortage of trucks. This message was written in steel atop the Channel waters on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships proclaimed that America's industrial force had arrived in Europe, changing everything forever.